What is the best video game of all time? That's the eternal question for gaming circles, with everyone having their own different opinion. It's an inherently subjective question, since art doesn't have any true objective methods of comparison. We can maybe evaluate how influential games were, but influence doesn't fully correlate to quality. These problems don't stop people from trying to answer the question anyway, mostly because it's fun to think about. There are hundreds of greatest video game lists out there, and when you read a bunch of them, you start to notice some commonalities. There's pretty much always extremely influential games like Ocarina of Time and Super Mario 64, which are great games that innovated the medium. You've also got a blend of more modern classics like Minecraft, even though it's over 13 years old at this point. What I want to talk about today, though, is a different game that very often appears near the top of these lists: Chrono Trigger. It's a Square JRPG from 1995, and it's a common answer for best RPG of all time, if not greatest game of all time. It's an excellent game all around, and it's one of my personal favorites too, but before I played it, I didn't understand why it had such a big reputation. I basically had never seen anything about Chrono Trigger outside of best video games of all time lists. It was difficult to find any traces of it in the gaming industry of today. It only had one sequel, which was met with mixed critical reception. So, why? Why is Chrono Trigger so lauded as one of the greatest games ever made, yet it seems like there's never been a truly successful follow-up? There are certainly a lot of RPGs that draw inspiration from Chrono Trigger, but at least in my opinion, none of them come close to capturing Chrono Trigger's magic. Today, we're going to analyze Chrono Trigger and dissect its masterful game design. Afterward, we're going to see if we can understand why attempts to replicate its success often miss the mark. Let's get into some disclaimers now. First, Chrono Trigger is older than I am. I did not grow up with it, and I have no nostalgia for it. This analysis is a retrospective take on the game. I can only guess what its reception and reputation was in the years of its initial release, and I have no idea what Japan's take on the game is today. Moving on, obviously, it's impossible for a game to be liked by everyone. I'm sure Chrono Trigger haters are out there, but if they are, I haven't actually met any. It's totally valid to not like the game, even if I strongly disagree. My goal is to highlight what I see as Chrono Trigger's strengths that I've yet to see any other game copy successfully. Maybe because it's simply not possible to do so, but we'll get there when we get there. The footage you'll be seeing is from the original SNES version of Chrono Trigger, which I chose to play to get the original experience. If you're interested in playing Chrono Trigger yourself, I recommend the DS or Steam versions instead, just for the various quality of life improvements. Finally, here is your one and only spoiler warning. We will be spoiling the entirety of Chrono Trigger from the bosses we fight to the ending of the story. Alright, we're now ready to begin. Welcome to Chrono Trigger. Let's begin by taking a look at a game design aspect that's at the very core of the Chrono Trigger experience: the art of setting player expectations and then subverting them. Everything in Chrono Trigger is designed with a conscious focus on managing player expectations. When you think of the genre RPG, what comes to mind? Well, let's also try to think in terms of 1995. You probably think of turn-based combat, maybe a fantasy setting with some sci-fi elements, but lots of monsters and magic. Perhaps even a silent protagonist with a cool sword. And, well, that's exactly what Chrono Trigger is like. On the surface, Chrono Trigger is your classic RPG. Below the surface, it's also a pretty classic RPG. Don't worry, I'm not here to argue that Chrono Trigger isn't like other RPGs. It absolutely is, and it plays into that role in a very interesting way. Chrono Trigger is very cognizant of how an RPG is typically expected to play out. It's still an RPG, but I would describe it as acutely self-aware. Not in a fourth wall sort of way, though. What Chrono Trigger actually does is recognize what players are probably thinking as they play through the game, and shakes things up just enough to keep players guessing when they think they have it all figured out. Let's take a look at some times when Chrono Trigger demonstrates this ability. The first is actually right at the beginning of the game. Our protagonist, Chrono, heads to the Millennium Fair. Here, the player is obligated to do nothing. All the game asks of you is to mess around in the fair and have fun. We're waiting for our friend Luca to finish setting up her carnival attraction. There are some minigames, tutorials, and fun NPC interactions to be had while we wait. The game will not progress until we bump into Marl and talk to a specific set of random NPCs, and I find this decision to be super interesting. There's no indication of what we need to do here. All we're told is to go and have fun at the fair. Why is that? What did the developers have in mind with this design choice? Well, I believe it's to force players to adopt a sense of curiosity and heavily encourage speaking with every NPC. While many modern games have a more streamlined story progression system, older games often had to rely on instruction manuals, strategy guides, and optional NPC dialogue to convey everything they wanted to. Chrono Trigger is no different. In fact, I'd say it relies on optional NPC dialogue more than the average old-school RPG, especially for the late-game side quests, but at least in my experience, I never got frustrated by this. I think that's because of how the fair sets our expectations for what we should do when we're stuck. Talk to NPCs. It just feels different in Chrono Trigger because it's an expectation the game itself sets, rather than a pre-existing one. To know that talking to NPCs is usually the answer in RPGs requires some prior knowledge of how the genre works. Chrono Trigger, on the other hand, subtly teaches this to the player by forcing us to engage with the game's NPCs. There's simply nothing else to do at this point in the game. That's all a pretty minor example of managing player expectations, but since it happens at the very beginning of the game, I figured it was worth mentioning. And also because it's directly connected to our next topic. So, if you didn't already know, Chrono Trigger is a game based on time travel. Luca's attraction was actually a teleportation device, but somehow it spawns a time gate to 400 years into the past and sucks Marl in. Chrono and Luca now have to go save her. We have a fun adventure saving Marl's very existence from a temporal paradox while teaming up with this cool frog warrior dude, and we're eventually successful and return to the present. During our trip to the past, we learn Marl is actually the current princess of the kingdom, so we go to take her home to the castle. When we do, we are accused of kidnapping the princess and are promptly arrested, despite Marl's protests. What happens in the real world when a person is charged with a crime? Well, they're entitled to a trial, and that's exactly what we get now. We are the defendant accused of kidnapping the princess standing trial in the Kingdom Court with a state-appointed defense attorney. The facts are clear. We were the last person seen with Marl and disappeared with her. That fact is not up for debate. Our defense is that Marl went with us willingly, and we didn't kidnap her or have any nefarious intentions. Naturally, the prosecution aims to dismantle our defense. They choose to question our character to prove that we had ill intent. The prosecution will cross-examine us, asking questions that imply negative things about us. We can try to deny them, but the prosecution is prepared for that. They have witnesses. Who are the witnesses? The people at the fair. As it turns out, Chrono Trigger was actually monitoring your actions during the festival the entire time. Didn't help the little girl find her lost cat? Held against your character in court. Tried to get Marl to sell her pendant? Used as evidence to show that you were trying to use Marl to make money. There are so many variations of the trial depending on what you did and didn't do during the festival. All of the seemingly random or meaningless actions actually have a real impact here. The trial is brilliant. In fact, I'd go as far as saying it's one of the greatest scenes in all of video games. The trial establishes one thing extremely well. Chrono Trigger is smarter than you. Just because it's a video game doesn't mean it's not watching your every move. You were told to have fun at the fair, but you're still obligated to be a good person, aren't you? The trial slaps you in the face with mistakes you made that you can't help but agree with. On my first playthrough, I felt like a complete dummy after the trial, but I was laughing and smiling all the while. I'm certain that most players got a guilty verdict on their first playthrough. There's no reasonable way to predict that your mundane choices that would be meaningless in every other RPG would come back to bite you here. That right there is Chrono Trigger's brilliance. It plays into the player's expectations and then subverts them at the perfect time to create memorable moments. The game does this plenty more times. Take, for example, the truth about Frog. When we first meet Frog, we learn he's a powerful swordsman that's on speaking terms with the Queen, but seems to be too ashamed to show his face in the palace. When we return to the Middle Ages later in the story, we hear about how the legendary hero has appeared to defeat the Fiend Lord Magus and save the world. We gather information on the hero, but the hero himself isn't what I want to talk about. During our information gathering, NPCs also tell us about the missing knight Cyrus, a powerful swordsman that vanished suddenly and hasn't been seen since. What are the implications here? Well, it's rather obvious. There just happens to be a conspicuously powerful swordsman familiar with the royal family but refuses to make contact with them. The explanation is simple. Somehow, Cyrus was transformed into Frog and is too ashamed to show his face, despite still serving the royal family from the shadows. It's a rather simple deduction to make, but it still feels good to solve. We later run into the legendary hero, who turns out to just be some village kid named Tata. He picked up something called the Mark of the Hero that a frog creature dropped. We later journey into the mountains to obtain the legendary sword Masamune, and its guardians tell us that only Cyrus had come this far before. We even make it to Frog's house and find a broken portion of the Masamune in a chest. The pieces all line up perfectly, and it's satisfying to see that our prediction a couple hours ago turned out to be true. Wait, hang on, sorry, what's that? What's this flashback we're seeing? Wow. It turns out Frog isn't Cyrus at all. Cyrus was really killed by Magus and is missing simply because he's dead. Frog is actually a guy called Glenn, who was Cyrus's friend that witnessed his death. That all happened 10 years ago, and today, Frog is still struggling to come to terms with Cyrus's death and living up to his legacy. He calls himself Frog because the name Glenn bears too much weight for him to carry at this point. All he can do to cope is try to help the royal family and unhealthily avoid his problems. And just like that, Chrono Trigger makes you think you've figured out where it's going, but it shakes things up just enough to stay ahead of you. Nothing ever directly proves that Frog and Cyrus are the same person. All the evidence is circumstantial at best. Connecting the two is nothing more than a guess, fueled at least in part by pre-existing bias for RPG story tropes. It's brilliant. It's nothing super complicated, but the game pulls off the twist extremely well. By the way, if you couldn't tell, Frog is my favorite character of the party. Oh, we should probably establish what our goal in Chrono Trigger is before we talk about anything else. After the trial, the corrupt Chancellor decides to have Chrono executed regardless of the outcome. There's a fun prison escape sequence afterward where eventually Chrono, Marl, and Luca wind up in another time gate that takes them to the distant future. This future is a barren, post-apocalyptic one. The party finds a computer database that shows what happened. A creature called Lavos destroyed the world. Obviously, we're not going to just stand by and let this future come to pass. Our goal is simple: defeat Lavos and save the future. This is the goal we will be working toward for the entire game, and by entire, I really mean that. There's hardly any filler in Chrono Trigger at all. Everything in the game serves to contribute to defeating Lavos or resolve the main party's character arcs. Even then, you could argue the arc resolutions are just ways of gaining strength to fight Lavos. Chrono Trigger is a very tight experience with a great sense of pacing. You're never in one area for too long, and nothing ever feels like a waste of time. That makes Chrono Trigger a very dense game. By that I mean you just go from a good, important moment to another good, important moment for basically the entire game. This density makes Chrono Trigger feel like a longer game than it actually is. When you remember your time playing a game, your memory probably first goes to the extremes, the parts you loved and the parts you hated. Since Chrono Trigger lacks filler that most players wouldn't have a strong opinion on, for the majority of players, it's just filled with loved segments. At least for me, There's not a single portion of Chrono Trigger's campaign that I don't like. Chrono Trigger is actually relatively short for an RPG. I would say the average RPG length is around 30 hours to complete the main story, especially in the 90s era of RPGs. Chrono Trigger, though, is barely 20 hours to finish the story and do all of the major side quests. You could easily finish the main story in under 20 hours. Chrono Trigger knows not to overstay its welcome. It's a game with no padding, and I really appreciate that about it. Alright, what have we established so far? Chrono Trigger is all about managing player expectations, and it crafts a memorable experience without any padding. That's all great, but that doesn't sound like something impossible to replicate. It'd be difficult, sure, but certainly not impossible. Well, I do have more to say on that front, but before we do that, I want to shift gears for a bit and talk about Chrono Trigger's combat system. Specifically, the RPG combat features Chrono Trigger chooses to include, and those it avoids. Chrono Trigger did not invent the active time bar battle system. If you're unfamiliar, it's essentially a system that adds a real-time aspect to turn-based combat. Next to each of your party members' health bar is another bar that gradually fills up in real time. When that bar is full, you can select an attack for that character to perform. That bar is filling up at all times except for during attack animations. The main complexity comes from how you don't have to take a character's turn as soon as their bar fills up. You can choose to wait for a different character's bar to fill and then have them take their turn first. It's a common strategy to have your healer on standby with a full attack bar so you could heal as soon as the enemy deals damage. Speaking of the enemy, they also play by the attack bar system, and that's what makes it conceptually interesting. Enemy attack bars are invisible to the player, but they have the same rules as the parties. If you're taking too long to think, then the enemy will cycle through turns at a quicker rate than you. It encourages quick thinking and adds some tension to the combat. It's a cool system, but it's kind of fallen out of favor in modern RPGs. A drawback is that sometimes you're just waiting around for your attack bars to fill up, not doing anything. It happens frequently enough to when I notice it, but I don't think it's a major problem. It's also not a problem specific to Chrono Trigger. If anything, Chrono Trigger attempts to solve this limitation of the system better than most games with it. Battles in Chrono Trigger take place in the overworld. There's no magical battle dimension commonly seen at the time in series like Final Fantasy. This allows for the environment itself to be used as a factor in battle. Enemies will move around the screen, and many of your skills have different effects depending on how close you are to the enemy, and if the enemy is isolated or grouped with others. Some enemies will also change forms periodically that leave them vulnerable to different types of attacks. Now when a party member's attack bar fills up, you have to weigh if it's optimal to attack immediately, or to wait for the enemies to change to a better position. The enemy's attack bar running in the background ensures you can't mull it over for too long, and this creates engaging combat. I'm a fan of the game's tech system as well. It's short for technique, and it's basically just special skills that each character can do. Every character has a unique skill set, and eventually you learn dual and triple techs, where 2 or 3 party members respectively team up for a more powerful attack. Every party member has unique individual strengths, and every party combination has unique strengths with the available combo techs. All of the game's party members feel useful, and I find myself switching up my party regularly just for fun. It's common for 1 or 2 party members to be worse off than the rest of the bunch in RPGs, but that's not true in Chrono Trigger. Everyone is viable. You're forced to use certain members sometimes, but for the most part, you can stick with your favorites or have a rotating ensemble. Another important thing to mention about Chrono Trigger's combat is its lack of random encounters. Enemies appear in consistent locations on the overworld. There's no randomness when it comes to finding battles. Random encounters have mostly vanished from modern gaming due to many finding them overly frustrating, but for a 90s RPG, they were industry standard. Let me remind you that Chrono Trigger was released in 1995. Its contemporaries were Final Fantasy VI and Dragon Quest VI. Even RPGs more than 10 years later were still regularly including random encounters. It seems like Chrono Trigger was ahead of its time. A major benefit of removing random encounters is how it normalizes the game's experience curve. The game will always have a fairly accurate idea of how much experience you will have gained throughout the story. The level curve and balancing of Chrono Trigger is superb for this reason. The game can actually be pretty challenging at times, but grinding is never required. If you get stuck on any fight, try changing your party lineup before anything else. The option to grind is still there if you feel like you need it or you just like doing it, but it's not needed whatsoever. It's not just the encounter method where Chrono Trigger differentiates itself, though. Just like in pretty much every RPG, there's a variety of status effects that enemies can inflict on your party during battle. There are some classics like Poison, which deals damage over time, and Blind, which makes your physical attacks less accurate. What's interesting, though, is that unlike its contemporaries, all of Chrono Trigger's status effects go away after battle. You'll never have to do anything like use an antidote in the overworld to avoid taking poison damage with each step. The mechanic simply doesn't exist in Chrono Trigger, and it's also a mechanic that doesn't really exist in modern RPGs anymore. Some games still have status conditions that persist after battle, but they don't have any negative impact in the overworld. Collectively, I think the industry has realized that negative overworld impact is just annoying. In theory, it forces the player to stock up on status healing items, but the player should be doing that anyway to prepare for being statused in battle. In practice, all negative overworld status does is heavily punish the player for not buying enough items. It's not a mechanical or strategical challenge. All it does is force the player to backtrack if they run out, and that's a really annoying punishment for no real benefit. So we've now established three things. Chrono Trigger's party is well balanced, there are no random encounters, and there are no overworld status conditions. All three of these have something in common. They all serve to alleviate common annoyances players have with RPGs. Players are free to use their preferred party lineup, never have to worry about too many random encounters, and have no fear of backtracking to the nearest town should they run out of antidotes. This is another key component for what makes Chrono Trigger special. It goes out of its way to consider what features could annoy players and ensures it doesn't include any of them. You could even include the lack of filler story content in this annoyance filter, as I call it. Now let's combine Chrono Trigger culling all the annoying parts of RPGs with its conscious effort to manage and subvert player expectations. What do both of those aspects tell us about Chrono Trigger's design philosophy? Well, I think they demonstrate the one thing Chrono Trigger values more than anything else: the player. Video games are an art form in the same way that books, movies, and TV shows are. It's common to liken art to being a conversation between the artist and the viewer. In the context of video games, the viewer is the player. Artists aim to convey something through their work. It can be literally anything. Maybe they want to invoke a certain emotion or provide perspective on nuanced topics. What is Chrono Trigger trying to convey? Well, I don't think the game's story is trying to get across deep philosophical themes or something like that. There are definitely complex subjects the game touches upon, but I don't think Chrono Trigger focuses on them. Instead, Chrono Trigger is simply concentrated on providing a fun, memorable, and personalized experience for the player. While this goal isn't unique to Chrono Trigger, it pulls it off exceptionally well. I mentioned earlier that the trial scene is an assertion that Chrono Trigger is smarter than you. It knows what you did, what you were thinking, and calls you out for your bad behavior. The trial is what Chrono Trigger utilizes to earn the player's respect. Once it has the player's respect, its guiding hand slips into the shadows. It's still watching, but never obviously so. Chrono Trigger never becomes condescending to the player, or to put it another way, it never becomes hand-holdy, even though it has proven its ability to do so if it wanted to. Chrono Trigger allows you to make the wrong decisions at the festival, and will continue to allow you to make wrong decisions forever. For the rest of the game after the trial, Chrono Trigger's story is a tree of diverging paths. Some decisions aren't impactful at all, others could change the outcome of side quests, and the most important ones directly affect the amount of characters in your party and the ending of the game. There are so many decisions in Chrono Trigger that I'd wager most players don't even realize that some actions they took were choices they made. Everything flows so naturally to create a continuous story that's influenced with the personal touch of the player's input. There's no better example of this than the late game climax. The party is attacked by Lavos in 12,000 BC unexpectedly, so they're caught off guard and must try to defend themselves. Unfortunately, the party isn't strong enough yet, and they are defeated. Chrono gets back on his feet, determined to fight to the end, and fight to the end he does. Lavos fires off a devastating attack, and Chrono dies. For real. The rest of the party is saved and sent to the planet's barren surface, but Chrono is gone. The game's protagonist. In 1995, an RPG had the guts to kill off its main character. While emotions are still high from Chrono's death, the remaining party members encounter the Fiend Lord Magus. We learned he was actually from 12,000 BC all along and wound up in the Middle Ages from Lavos' time distortion powers. He was only trying to summon Lavos so he could kill it. That doesn't change the fact that Magus had Cyrus killed and Glenn turned into Frog, on top of being complacent with his army of fiends committing atrocities in the Middle Ages. We have all the context for who Magus is now and why he did what he did, and the player can choose how Magus' story ends. Are his sins too heavy to ignore? Should Frog bravely challenge Magus to avenge Cyrus, making up for his failure to do so originally? That way Frog can at last find inner peace and return to his human form? Or is the moral that revenge solves nothing and creates a cycle of anger? You know what they say, after all, the enemy of your enemy is your friend, right? And Magus wants to kill Lavos too. We could form a truce and join forces, especially since the party is weakened from Chrono's death. Each of these options is a distinct possibility that can happen with Magus. The player can freely choose to kill him or recruit him into their party for the rest of the game. There's no correct story choice here, it's entirely up to the player. Once again, let me remind you that this game was released in 1995, and it has its secondary antagonist as a recruitable character. He's not even reformed either. He keeps his distance from the rest of the party, and rightfully so, honestly. Magus joining the party is just a truce, and he never truly becomes one of them. It doesn't change the fact that he caused a great amount of harm, and the player isn't wrong if they choose to kill him. If I have one criticism of Chrono Trigger, it would probably be that almost every NPC doesn't comment on Magus' presence in your party, even though they realistically would be shocked. Chrono Trigger has such good attention to detail in all other aspects that this touch being absent is strange. It's not a big deal at all, but it would have been nice to see. So, Magus' fate is up to the player, and actually so is Chrono's. You see, Chrono Trigger does that subversion thing again here. It's extraordinarily rare for a game to kill off its protagonist in the middle of the story. It's even rarer when that death is real. Chrono is actually dead. You can finish the game and get a good ending without him, but if you go out of your way, it is possible to save him. There's a lengthy side quest to revive him, but it's completely optional. If you think you're smarter than Chrono Trigger and believe the protagonist will come back just like they always do in RPGs so you continue with the main story, you will be thoroughly fooled. Being fooled can be a good thing though. It's just like the trial. That makes you feel dumb but in a funny way. While I didn't personally experience finishing the game without Chrono, I imagine if I did, my reaction would just be respect. Respect for the game letting you skip reviving the main character. And while we're back on the subject of Subversion again, I really want to highlight one more example that's found in the final boss fight. Before that, though, let's talk about the final boss itself. It's Lavos. You can fight him whenever you want. You won't win, but the option is technically available to you. The fight against Lavos when Chrono dies is actually also technically winnable, but extremely unlikely for your power level at that point in the game. There are alternate endings for how early you can beat Lavos, which is pretty cool. It's infeasible to do so without excessive grinding or being on New Game Plus, but I really appreciate that the ending variations are included. Oh yeah, this game has New Game Plus. Did I mention it was released all the way back in 1995 yet? Anyway, back to what I wanted to talk about in the first place. The true Lavos fight at the end of the main story has a lot of phases. The final phase is against the Lavos core, which takes place inside Lavos itself. The core has a familiar look to it, a big, scary, and strong centerpiece with two supporting pieces by its sides. There are many bosses with this structure in the game. Early on, we fight a security system in 2300 AD, where the gimmick is you have to destroy the support pieces first. If you don't, the main system will hit you with a powerful counterattack. Later, we fight Giga Gaia on Mount Woe, which uses a similar structure. Even the second to last phase of the Lavos fight itself follows this template. This type of boss fight isn't even an RPG-specific trope. It's just a common design for a boss fight, and that's what Chrono Trigger wants you to believe. One last time, it has to prove it's smarter than you and was pulling the strings the entire time. You see, if you try the same strategy as you've done many times before, you'll notice something is off. The left core goes down relatively quickly, but the right core seems to have a lot of defense. Wait, did the center core just die? The fight's still going? Yeah. The real Lavos core is actually the right side support piece. The center is just a distraction. The fight's not over until you destroy the right side core, which will regenerate the others. It's a really clever subversion of this boss design trope, and it's representative of Chrono Trigger's design philosophy as a whole. It understands what players expect. It plays into the expectations just enough to give the player comfort, but then takes control and changes it up at the last moment just enough to stand out. So that's pretty much it. Chrono Trigger is meticulously designed around the player being the driving force of the experience. It plays into player expectations only to subvert them, cuts out common player annoyances of RPGs way before the rest of the genre caught up to it, and it's a game full of meaningful choices where the player's input directly impacts the experience they get. When I put it like that, it just sounds like Chrono Trigger's an amazing game. And, well, yes, that's true, but what did I mean when I said recreating it would be impossible? Well, okay, I can't definitively say replicating Chrono Trigger's success is truly impossible, but I would bet a lot of money that we will never get anything quite like it again. The justification for this is pretty simple, actually. Creating an experience where the player is so involved and cared for like in Chrono Trigger is ridiculously hard. It's a miracle that Chrono Trigger itself even exists in the first place. Chrono Trigger was a passion project by a group of people that wanted to make something no one had done before. Who was the group of people, you might ask? Well, Square called it the Dream Team, the creative trio of Hironobu Sakaguchi, creator of Final Fantasy, Yuji Horii, creator of Dragon Quest, and Akira Toriyama, creator of Dragon Ball. There was plenty of other talent on the development team too, but those three names coming together is borderline fanfiction. I don't even know what the equivalent dream team would be for the modern gaming industry. Those three people are absolute creative titans that made legendary franchises. If there was anyone in the industry who had the skills to create a subversive player-centric RPG without it ever becoming condescending or overly handholdy, it would be them. It's a dangerous line to tread upon, since going too far can take the player out of the experience. Luckily, Chrono Trigger never does that thanks to the skill and talent of its developers. There's also another problem. At the time Chrono Trigger released, the gaming industry was still young. The game is nearly 30 years old at this point, and in the realm of video games, that may as well be centuries ago. The industry has exploded in growth. It's impossible to understate how different games are nowadays to how they were 30 years ago. A consequence of this is it's much more difficult to evaluate what player expectations are. There are so many ways to experience video games now, and so many different takes on the various genres, that it's really hard to quantify what the average player expects a game to do. For all the praise I gave Chrono Trigger for setting expectations and then subverting them, it mostly does this in the context of 90s RPG tropes. That is a much more narrow scope than what we see in games nowadays. While I would love to see another game that captures the true essence of Chrono Trigger, I just don't know if it's realistic to happen at this point. There are a lot of games that directly draw inspiration from Chrono Trigger, but I don't think any of them were able to nail that aspect of player involvement. Some games include the player in a really interesting way, like Undertale, but that's more of a meta or fourth wall breaking type of involvement, which is not what Chrono Trigger does. If a game that's so expertly designed around the player exists out there, I would love to see it. Hey, I would love to be wrong on this one. Unfortunately, though, I don't think I am. And while I don't believe we will ever get another game like Chrono Trigger, I am very glad that we got Chrono Trigger in the first place. As I've already mentioned, it's an amazing game and it's one of my personal favorites. It may be 30 years old, but it still holds up extremely well today, and I highly recommend playing it if you haven't done so already. We've now finally reached the end. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe so I can make more videos like these. Before we truly end, there are a couple of things I wanted to mention that didn't quite fit anywhere in the script. First, the Kingdom of Zeal is extremely cool. A past advanced civilization living in the sky on floating islands is just perfect. The music that plays there, Corridors of Time, is one of my favorite soundtracks in all of gaming too. Second, as if the game weren't good enough already, Chrono Trigger's side quest design is amazing. I love how the party's ability to time travel is able to make the solution to all the side quests so clever. Finally, this video happens to be much shorter than the others I've made on this channel so far, which you should totally watch if you haven't already, by the way. It just worked out that way and wasn't a conscious decision. That said, let me know in the comments how you feel about videos around this length. There's definitely a lot of games where I can think of topics to make videos on, but they wouldn't be substantial enough for the hour-long deep dives I've done before. Alright, that's it for real. Thank you once again for watching, and see you next time.